The wind tore through the night like the scream of 1,000 soldiers. Torches flickered against the looming walls, casting shadows that danced like monsters. Horses snorted, restless. Armor clanged in the darkness. And somewhere, a single horn shattered the silence. Something was coming. Not a raid, not a rumor. Something far older, far deadlier. Men froze mid-step, eyes wide, breath visible in the cold air as the sound grew closer, relentless, unstoppable. A messenger arrived, panting, collapsing at the commander's feet. His hands shook. His words tumbled out like stones. "They've crossed the ridge we cannot hold." No one knew how many. No one knew their strength. Only that fear had taken root in the heart of every soldier. The enemy moved with a precision that felt almost unnatural. There was no room for hesitation, no time for prayer, no escape from the terror building in that frozen night. And yet this was not a story of myth, not of Dracula with his fangs and castles. This terror was real. Something in the east, in the shadow of mountains and forests, had grown strong enough to make even the Ottoman Empire pause and tremble. Whispers spread through the ranks. Who is this man? What army defies the Sultan so boldly? How can one fortress, one people stand against him? The night dragged on. Every sound, branches cracking, a distant shout, the echo of hooves, was amplified, twisted, made monstrous. A single mistake could cost them everything. And then silence. The kind of silence that makes you question if you ever truly heard the fear, or if it was always inside you. What force could strike such terror into an empire that prided itself on conquering worlds? And why did the name Stephen the Great echo in the minds of men long before Dracula ever haunted their nightmares? One question hung heavier than the darkness itself. How had he become more feared than any legend? To understand the terror, we must first step back into the world of the 15th century. Europe was a patchwork of principalities, kingdoms, and empires, each struggling to survive in an era defined by war, betrayal, and shifting alliances. The year is 1475. The Ottoman Empire, vast and unstoppable, presses relentlessly into Eastern Europe. Their armies have toppled walls, cities, and even kings, leaving destruction wherever they march. In the east, a small principality sits wedged between mountains and rivers. Its land is rugged, its people hardened, and its leaders learned early that survival demanded cunning and unyielding discipline. The surrounding powers often underestimate its significance, assuming that sheer numbers alone can crush resistance. But this region has something the Ottomans cannot predict: resolve born from generations of hardship, and a commander whose reputation spreads faster than the fastest messenger. Military logistics in this period were brutal. Armies could not carry infinite supplies. Soldiers marched for weeks, living off the land, enduring harsh weather and disease. Communication was slow, reliant on couriers on horseback. A single misstep or delay could lead to catastrophe. For this reason, fortresses were vital. They were more than walls and towers. They were statements of defiance. One fortress could stall an empire for months, buying time that might mean life or death. For the Ottomans, the Carpathian frontier represented not just a border but a gateway to influence and tribute. Each city conquered was a step closer to ultimate dominion. And yet, reports began to filter back, rumors of defeats, humiliating ambushes, and an enemy who moved like a shadow, striking with precision no one could anticipate. The stories were so consistent that even seasoned commanders began to doubt themselves. The tension was palpable. Villagers whispered of invincible warriors hiding in forests. Scouts returned with tales of ambushes where attackers seemed to vanish into the trees as quickly as they appeared. Ottoman strategists found their calculations undermined by unpredictability, their confidence shaken by a name that spread across the region like wildfire: Stephen the Great. Historians later called him a prince. Soldiers called him a nightmare. To the Ottomans, he became an embodiment of resistance itself, an obstacle not merely of force, but of cunning, audacity, and strategy. And yet, No chronicler could fully explain why a man commanding so few could inspire fear greater than any vampire legend whispered in taverns. As we will see, this was not a figure of superstition. He was flesh, blood, and iron. But to those who faced him, he might as well have been a force of nature, as terrifying and unstoppable as the winter wind howling through the Carpathian passes. To understand Stephen the Great, we must first step into the lives of those who served under him. Soldiers were not born warriors. They were trained, drilled, and molded into instruments of precision. Each day began before sunrise. The clang of steel on wood echoed through the training yard. Shields were polished until they gleamed. Swords were sharpened to a dangerous edge. Archers practiced until their shoulders ached. Discipline was merciless. Failure could mean punishment, humiliation, or even exile. But alongside the harshness was a deeper structure. Every soldier knew their role, their place in the hierarchy. They learned not just to fight, but to anticipate, to adapt, to survive in terrain that favored cunning over brute strength. A soldier under Stephen's command was expected to endure hunger, harsh winters, and long marches without complaint. Yet they also learned strategy, deception, and the art of psychological warfare, the ability to strike fear before the first sword even fell. Emotional resilience was as critical as physical stamina. Soldiers were taught to trust each other completely, to operate as a single organism. Every patrol, every fortification, every night watch demanded focus and vigilance. Lapses were not tolerated. Mistakes were exploited mercilessly by enemies. And the men knew that the ruler they served would not hesitate to make tough decisions for the survival of the principality. Stephen himself was a figure both inspiring and exacting. He spent hours studying maps, analyzing enemy movements, and devising strategies that often seemed impossible. Yet when he addressed his troops, there was a clarity that cut through fear. Soldiers could see that every order had purpose, every maneuver was calculated, and every risk had been weighed. In the presence of this leadership, even the most ordinary men became capable of extraordinary feats. Stories circulated among the ranks, of scouts disappearing into forests and returning with tales of ambushes, of enemies walking into traps they could not even sense. These tales fueled a mixture of awe and fear. Soldiers didn't simply obey orders, they internalized a sense of mission, understanding that the survival of their homeland depended on their vigilance, courage, and ingenuity. And yet, despite this rigorous structure, uncertainty lingered. No training could fully prepare them for the chaos that awaited. Every soldier knew the mountain passes were treacherous, the rivers unpredictable, and the Ottomans relentless. But they also knew that under Stephen's command, they might just survive where others would perish. The dichotomy of fear and hope created a tension that shaped every moment of their daily lives. By immersing ourselves in this world, we begin to understand why the Ottomans, despite their vast armies, would come to dread facing Stephen the Great. It was not just his leadership, but the very culture of preparedness, cunning, and unyielding resolve that he instilled in every man who served under him. In the weeks before the decisive confrontations, the land itself seemed to shift under an invisible hand. Small details began to unsettle the Ottoman forces, though few understood their meaning at the time. A forest that had once been quiet now thrummed with strange movement. Scouts reported glimpses of shadowy figures disappearing behind trees, yet when men pressed forward, the woods appeared empty. The same paths that had been safe for caravans and armies suddenly became perilous. Rocks shifted, narrow passes became treacherous, and fog lingered where it had never lingered before. At night, the usual rhythm of the frontier, the barking of dogs, the creaking of gates, the distant chatter of watchmen, diminished until it vanished entirely. Villages grew eerily quiet. Even locals whispered of strange phenomena, doors that were left open during the day found locked in the morning, livestock that wandered off only to reappear far from home, and sudden gusts of wind that carried voices, or seemed to. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter and felt eyes watching from invisible vantage points, the feeling so sharp it made their skin crawl. The first obvious signs of unease were subtle. Messengers reported delays and missing correspondence. Couriers would leave with urgent orders and return days later, exhausted, claiming that they had been waylaid. But by what? Some said that entire stretches of road were watched by unseen forces, and travelers were forced to retreat. Even experienced officers began to feel that the terrain itself was betraying them. Then came the strange disappearances of small Ottoman units. Patrols sent to scout the mountains would return only in fragments, or not at all. Survivors told tales of ambushes that left no trace of the enemy, describing attacks so precise and coordinated that they seemed almost supernatural. Entire companies reported sudden silences in communication. When reinforcements arrived, they found that units had vanished without a trace. Each missing soldier intensified the fear in those who remained. Supply lines faltered in ways that seemed almost impossible. Wagons carrying food or ammunition would fail to arrive, their tracks interrupted, often with no sign of robbery or sabotage. Soldiers began to suspect traps, ambushes, or worse. Every wrong turn became a potential death sentence. Commanders grew tense, whispering of ghost armies and unseen enemies moving faster than scouts could report. In towns near the frontier, rumors began to spread among the people. Villagers described strange lights flickering in the trees at dusk, fires that appeared and vanished, and sudden sounds of drums or horns without visible armies. Some claimed they saw mounted riders appear atop ridges for a moment and then disappear entirely into the forest, as if the land itself swallowed them. Even the natural world seemed to conspire. Birds would vanish mid-flight, wolves would circle menacingly without attack, and rivers would rise and fall unpredictably, cutting off routes the Ottoman army relied upon. Every anomaly, every missed call, every strange silence built a growing sense of dread that no leader could dismiss. And yet there were no answers. Each warning was isolated at first, then patterns emerged, but they were inconsistent, almost impossible to interpret. Ottoman strategists tried to rationalize, attributing delays to poor weather, rogue bandits, or miscommunication, but the evidence grew too consistent to ignore. Every strange occurrence, every misstep of supply and scouting, painted the unmistakable picture of an enemy who was not only prepared but anticipating every move. The soldiers began to talk quietly among themselves, hesitant to speak above a whisper, fearing that even their words might carry danger. The Prince in the Forest, they called him, a name whispered in terror, a presence that seemed to stretch across every hill, every valley, every shadow. Even without seeing him, the Ottoman army felt his strategy, his vigilance, his cunning. By the time the first horns announced the approach of battle, the enemy was already on edge. What had begun as subtle signs, strange silences, missed messages, disappearing units, had become a palpable, suffocating tension. The stage was set not just for conflict, but for fear itself. And in that mounting dread, every soldier, every commander, would soon learn that warning signs were not just omens. They were prelude to a force they had no idea how to confront. Dawn broke over the mountains with a cold, gray light. Mist clung to the ridges like a living thing, swallowing the valleys and making the paths ahead uncertain. The Ottoman army moved forward confidently, believing their numbers and discipline would carry them through the rugged terrain. Yet, from the tree line, the forests and cliffs watched silently, hiding a force that had anticipated their every move. The first signs of trouble were subtle. A patrol sent to scout a narrow pass returned hours late, disoriented and silent. When questioned, the soldiers could only describe shadows flitting between trees, sudden noises that echoed unnaturally, and a feeling of being surrounded, even when the forest appeared empty. The officers dismissed the accounts at first, assuming fatigue or fear, but unease had begun to spread. Then it escalated. Archers in the vanguard fired into what seemed like empty spaces, and arrows were returned by forces that were never seen. Cavalry charges met unexpected obstacles, hidden trenches, rocks dislodged strategically, and forested paths that funneled them into positions where ambushes were inevitable. Horses skidded, men shouted in confusion, and the carefully planned formations began to break apart under the pressure of an invisible hand. Communication became nearly impossible. Messengers galloped between units only to return hours later with inconsistent reports, claiming entire detachments had vanished. Flags and signals were misread or ignored in the fog of confusion. Commands shouted over the din, were drowned by the echoing mountains and the sudden cacophony of movement from unseen enemies. The soldiers on the front lines felt trapped. Every step forward seemed predetermined, as if the forest itself guided them into mistakes. Spears and swords met resistance in unpredictable places, while other paths that seemed clear became impassable. Smoke rose from distant ambush points, but when reinforcements arrived, there was nothing to find. No enemy, no evidence, only the aftermath of disrupted formations and panicked men. Horses bolted, riders called out, and commanders shouted orders that were never followed. The Ottoman army, accustomed to control and coordination, experienced chaos on a scale they had never seen. The sounds of battle, clanging armor, shouted commands, the pounding of hooves, echoed off the mountains and valleys in ways that confused even the most disciplined units. It became impossible to discern where the attack was coming from, how many were engaged, or even which direction was safe. By midday, the confusion had reached its peak. Entire companies were unaccounted for. Messengers reported that units had been cut off or surrounded, only to discover later that their supposed positions were empty. Some soldiers described brief glimpses of figures moving in patterns that suggested coordination far beyond the small number of troops present. Others swore that attacks came simultaneously from directions that should have been impossible, as if the enemy could be in two places at once. The psychological toll was immense. Fear spread faster than arrows or swords. Soldiers became hesitant, mistrusting one another, hesitant to follow orders. The mountain air, the mist, and the strange sounds amplified every doubt, every misstep, turning routine maneuvers into hazards. The Ottomans realized they were not simply facing an army, they were facing anticipation itself, a force that seemed to predict their actions before they made them. And then, as quickly as the chaos had begun, silence fell. Not the relief of victory, but the unnatural quiet of absence. Men froze, listening. No clanging of armor, no shouts, no hooves. The mist seemed to press down on them, heavy and suffocating. Entire units were missing. Paths that should have led to other companies led only to empty forest or impassable cliffs. The Ottomans could not tell whether the enemy had withdrawn, disappeared, or simply never been there in the numbers they feared. Survivors later recounted the disorientation. They spoke of seeing comrades vanish into mist, of hearing commands that came from nowhere, and of moving through valleys that felt like traps even when no ambush existed. No one could explain how small, disciplined units had been scattered so completely, how terrain and timing had been manipulated so flawlessly, or why fear had become a weapon more effective than any blade. By evening, the Ottoman army had retreated to regroup, shaken to its core. What remained was confusion, frustration, and an overwhelming sense of being outmatched not just by numbers or skill, but by strategy, anticipation, and the will of a commander who seemed everywhere at once. The battle had been fought, yet no one could claim a clear understanding of what had truly occurred. In that silence, one reality emerged. Stephen the Great had transformed chaos itself into a weapon. He had turned fear into precision, anticipation into power, and mountains into traps. The Ottoman forces had faced something beyond mere soldiers. They had faced the embodiment of strategy, cunning, and relentless foresight. And in that moment, it became clear why this man would terrify an empire long after the battlefield fell silent. The sun had barely risen when the Ottomans realized the full scale of the disaster. What had begun as a chaotic engagement now revealed itself as an unexplainable disappearance. Entire units that had marched with discipline and confidence were gone, vanished as if swallowed by the mountains. Officers called for immediate searches, but the misty valleys and dense forests resisted every effort. Trails ended abruptly. Horses were found wandering alone, and abandoned weapons lay scattered with no clue as to who had taken them or where. Scouts and search parties combed the hills and ridges for days. They moved carefully, checking every path, every river crossing, and every hidden glade. Yet the more they searched, the more questions emerged. Small groups of soldiers would appear miles from their last known position, exhausted, disoriented, claiming that they had been attacked by forces that seemed to vanish in an instant. Others spoke of hearing commands shouted from nowhere, or of seeing glimpses of figures that disappeared behind trees that could not conceal them. The surviving Ottoman officers were baffled. They reconstructed maps, retraced the battle, and interrogated survivors, but the stories never aligned. One officer swore he had seen a company trapped at the ridge, only for another report to place the same soldiers hours later in a completely different valley. Couriers carried urgent messages, but some never arrived. Others returned with notes they claimed were altered, or with orders that no one could verify. Attempts at rational explanation were made. Perhaps these were guerrilla tactics, local militias assisting Stephen's forces, or simply errors in navigation and communication. Yet the precision and timing described by multiple eyewitnesses defied such explanations. The more the Ottoman army investigated, the more it became clear that they had faced an enemy who anticipated their every move. Every reconnaissance effort seemed anticipated and neutralized before it could yield results. Local villagers were interrogated. They offered little clarity, though their stories added to the eerie atmosphere. Some claimed to have seen troops moving along ridges where maps indicated no path existed. Others described the prints in the forest appearing as if from nowhere, inspecting positions, and then vanishing before anyone could approach. The boundaries between legend and fact began to blur. Meanwhile, official reports were inconsistent. Written accounts differed in detail and scope, some records mysteriously missing or erased. Certain dispatches from commanders were classified or sent to Istanbul with vague summaries, leaving gaps in the historical record. Soldiers who had witnessed the events were often silent, either out of fear, confusion, or orders from higher command. Historians later speculated that some reports were deliberately obscured to protect reputations, hide failures, or conceal the effectiveness of Stephen's strategy. Despite extensive searches, no concrete evidence emerged to fully explain what had occurred. The Ottomans were left with fragments, tracks that ended abruptly, missing units, inconsistent eyewitness testimonies, and the lingering sense that they had been outmaneuvered at every turn. The forest, the mountains, and the cunning of Stephen's forces had created an almost perfect enigma. By the end of the week, the army had retreated, demoralized and uncertain. Commanders who once felt invincible now questioned every assumption. The search concluded without answers, leaving only whispers of the prince who could strike and disappear at will. What exactly happened on those ridges and valleys remained unknown, and in the months and years that followed, even the most careful Ottoman historians could not reconstruct the events with certainty. One fact, however, was undeniable. Stephen the Great had demonstrated a mastery of strategy and deception, so complete that his enemy's understanding of the battlefield itself had been shattered. In that silence, in those vanished units, and in the contradictory records, a legend was forged, one that would haunt the memory of an empire long after the dust of battle settled. Centuries have passed since the Ottoman forces retreated from the mountains, yet historians, strategists, and storytellers continue to debate exactly what happened. What allowed a relatively small principality to defy a vast empire? Why did Stephen the Great inspire terror that eclipsed even the legends of Dracula? Over time, several theories have emerged, each plausible, each incomplete, and each shrouded in uncertainty. Many scholars argue that Stephen's intimate knowledge of the Carpathian passes gave him an almost supernatural advantage. He knew every ridge, river, and forest path. He could predict where an enemy would falter and strike with precision. Ambushes were set in places considered impassable, forces moved in complete silence, and traps exploited natural obstacles. Yet even this theory cannot explain every reported incident. Some Ottoman units claimed attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, or that forces appeared where no human could have been in time. Was terrain mastery enough, or was there more at work? Another explanation points to fear as a deliberate weapon. Stephen's reputation, whispered across villages and military camps, created a psychological effect. Soldiers expected ambushes, hesitated, and faltered before any attack even came. Accounts describe units breaking ranks not because of superior force, but because they believed the enemy was everywhere at once. But this theory has its limits. Multiple independent reports describe actions too precise to be explained by fear alone. Could terror itself have been a force multiplier, or did legend merely amplify reality? Some historians suggest Stephen commanded unrecorded forces, local militias, peasants, or mercenaries, who knew secret paths and operated with deadly efficiency. These irregular troops could strike quickly and vanish, explaining the sudden disappearances of Ottoman units. Yet, if these forces existed, why are they absent from records? Were witnesses silenced? Were maps and logs deliberately erased to protect sensitive intelligence? The very absence of proof strengthens both the theory and the mystery. Legends grow from fear, and some theorists argue that reports of vanishing soldiers, impossible movements, and eerie silences suggest Stephen's campaigns acquired an almost mythic aura. Tales describe his forces appearing as if from the mist, striking without warning, and retreating before the enemy could respond. Was it strategy, luck, or something beyond comprehension? We cannot answer. Contemporary Ottoman reports are vague or contradictory, leaving room for whispers of something uncanny, but unproven. Across all theories, one detail remains constant: contradictions, missing records, and silenced witnesses. Ottoman archives contain gaps, lost dispatches, and inconsistent battle reports. Survivors often gave conflicting testimonies. Letters and maps were classified or destroyed. Some historians speculate that even in the empire's heart, officials may have deliberately concealed the truth to avoid embarrassment. The result is a puzzle that has never been solved. Each theory holds some truth, but none fully explains the phenomenon. The combination of terrain mastery, psychological warfare, hidden allies, and the legend that grew around Stephen created a perfect storm that confounded even the most disciplined army of the 15th century. And yet, as you read the theories, doubt lingers. Which explanation is closest to reality? Were the Ottomans outsmarted, outmaneuvered, or haunted by fear itself? Or does the truth lie in the fragments of reports that never reached Istanbul, in the villagers who whispered secrets they could not record, or in files deliberately erased from history? One thing is certain: Stephen the Great's legacy cannot be reduced to numbers, tactics, or legend alone. It exists in the contradictions, the gaps, and the unsolvable mysteries of that fateful campaign, an enduring enigma that continues to haunt the memory of an empire long after the mountains fell silent. History remembers battles, empires, and kings, but sometimes the most enduring stories are those that cannot be fully explained. Stephen the Great was more than a prince or a soldier. He was a force, a strategist, a mind that transformed fear into power and uncertainty into a weapon. The Ottoman Empire, vast and unstoppable on paper, faced not just an army, but the embodiment of foresight, cunning, and resolve. The records left behind are incomplete, contradictory, and sometimes deliberately obscured. Reports vanish, witnesses fall silent, maps are lost, and yet the echo of his campaigns resonates across centuries. We may never know precisely how he moved, how he struck, or how he made entire units vanish from the field without leaving a trace. What we do know is that Stephen became a legend, not because he was supernatural, but because he understood the power of unpredictability, the terror that comes from being outmaneuvered, and the skill of transforming every small advantage into a psychological edge. His enemy feared him more than any vampire myth, more than any whispered tale of Dracula. And in that fear lies the true genius of Stephen the Great. The mountains still stand, the forests still hide secrets, and the question lingers, was Stephen merely a brilliant tactician, or was there something else at work, something the Ottomans never understood, and perhaps something history itself cannot explain? We may never have the answers, but the mystery invites us to imagine, to speculate, and to feel the tension that gripped men who faced him centuries ago. So, what do you believe? Was it sheer genius, clever deception, or a force that borders on legend itself? Share your theories in the comments, and decide for yourself how a single man became more feared than any myth, and why the shadow of Stephen the Great still haunts the memory of an empire long vanished.